Okay, so it is a pleasure to be part of this panel today and hearing fascinating work of Ingrid, Arvind, and Kyle. So today I'll be sharing with you some of our work towards developing a community microgrid in the Gaza Strip. This is the first community microgrid ICRC is implementing. So we're first piloting it here in Gaza with hopes of then developing similar projects in other contexts. At this point, we're still quite early in the stage of the project. We're just wrapping up our in-house feasibility study, so I'll be focusing more on the journey that we have taken to get to this stage. So first, considering the unique complexities of Gaza's context, it's interesting to briefly understand some of the challenges resulting from the ongoing conflict between Israel and Palestine. Firstly, there's the blockade that has been in place since 2007. And this is largely restricting movement of Gazans in and out, restricting trade and the ability of Gaza to connect with the international market, and also restricting the entry of any material that is considered dual use. Dual use items can be what's considered usable for military aims. But this is quite broadly interpreted and often includes items such as cement and pipes, which are vital for repairs and reconstruction of infrastructure. It's been estimated by the World Bank that this blockade has caused about a 50% drop in Gaza's GDP since 2007. Secondly, there's the issue of destruction. So over 3 years, there was 3 wars in Gaza over 6 years in 2008, 2012, and 2014. Now, these wars not only caused a high number of deaths and injuries, but also caused severe damage to some critical infrastructure, including water and wastewater networks, the Gaza power plant, which is still only operating at 66% of its original capacity due to the damages. Thirdly, there's the issue of population growth. So Gaza has a fertility rate of about 4.5 children per woman, which results in an annual growth rate of 3.4%. Therefore, the population is going to go from 2 million today to about 4 million in 2040, which essentially doubles the demands in 20 years. There is also a high unemployment rate in Gaza related to the economic situation I described, which means about 50% of Gaza is facing unemployment, and those that are employed, about 80% earn below the statutory minimum wage. This means that things like electricity bills become quite unaffordable for households to consider. Specifically in the electricity sector, Gaza faces additional challenges. There's approximately a 55% deficit of electricity supply to Gaza, with only 45% of the demands being met. Gaza receives electricity from 3 main sources. Firstly, these 10 Israeli lines shown in blue, that's up to 120 megawatts. Egyptian lines in the bottom in gray, there's 3 lines, but they have not been operating since 2018. And in red is the Gaza power plant, which produces between 20 to 80 megawatts, depending on fuel availability. And you have to note that the fuel is often coming from external sources. So in this case, all 3 sources are very highly dependent on the outside world, which makes them quite vulnerable to and subjected to political interference. Also, we have a fairly inefficient electricity grid in Gaza. There's a few issues. So first of all, due to the supply deficit, the electricity utility has to rotate the electricity to different sections of the grid. And since the switches are mostly manually operated, this means that teams of technicians have to go around Gaza each day to switch on and off sections of the grid. There's also a lack of connections between supply lines. So a lot of the supply lines have a radial layout, and this limits the ability to redirect electricity to meet the changing needs or in case a supply line is damaged. There's also very little in the way of demand data due to the lack of modern technology in the grid, which limits the ability for the utility to have an accurate understanding of the demands of the various sectors and limits their ability to optimize the supply. There's approximately 30% losses in the network, both technical and non-technical, and these are resulting technical losses from poor electrical components and cables, and non-technical losses from electricity theft. And finally, there's also quite low revenue collection rates, between 50–60%. And again, this is related to the poor economic situation in Gaza. So let's look at how some of the consequences, how the consequences are affecting life in Gaza. Well, there's about rotating schedules of 6 to 12 hours per day. This has impacts on many of the sectors, including the water and wastewater treatment and pumping, the provision of healthcare services, local businesses, households, and public facilities. So as a coping mechanism, many of those that can afford it have installed backup generators and now increasingly also solar panels. However, running generators also brings a new set of problems to the equation because now we have an issue with air and noise pollution in Gaza, as well as the expense of being able to access fuel and then also get spare parts in Gaza where it's difficult to access these things. It's estimated that there are approximately 100,000 generators in Gaza, and they can consume up to 500,000 liters of fuel per day. So one of our main aims in Gaza in the ICRC is to strengthen the resilience of essential services and communities. So resilience is the ability of a system to absorb, adapt, and recover from a shock or a stress. In Gaza, a shock can be an escalation in the hostilities, while stresses can include population growth and then the subsequent demands from that. Although almost all sectors are reliant on electricity to operate, so we've identified electricity shortages as one of the major constraints reducing the resilience of almost all sectors and impacting almost all facets of life in Gaza. Having developed a better understanding of some of the challenges and complexities with the electricity system, we wanted to know how is the population coping with the electricity gap left by the public supply. So to answer this, we went around Gaza and documented all the various electricity coping mechanisms we could find. We also asked who are managing these systems and what are the coping mechanisms when it comes to generation and distribution of energy, control techniques, management setups, and how can we develop and scale up well-functioning initiatives. So we were able to identify and categorize 23 different types of coping mechanisms and build an understanding of how the formal and the informal energy market was being managed. So while these coping mechanisms are still far from bridging the gap left by the public power provision, they're at least providing us with a framework for ideas to be pulled together and partnerships that can be created that can help us to provide a more holistic solution to the energy gap. So it was from this thinking that we were able to start thinking about the idea of a community microgrid. Again, our main aim is to strengthen resilience. So in light of this, a microgrid would improve the redundancy, flexibility, and reliability of the electricity supply for a community, thereby increasing its resilience to disruptions. The idea was to ensure that all functional aspects of the community could be connected together in a microgrid so that the community as a whole could remain functional during periods of electrical disruption. The microgrid is essentially a combination of decentralized energy sources such as solar, diesel generators, and batteries, and smart grid components like smart meters, auto reclosers, and SCADA. In our case, we want the microgrid to be able to function both on and off grid, and these are usually referred to as grid interactive or hybrid microgrids. So when the utility is on, it is powering the microgrid, and the surplus solar electricity is able to feed into the network based on a net metering agreement with the utility. When the utility is off, the community microgrid is isolated from the network and the microgrid is powered by the decentralized energy sources. So in theory, this is what we were trying to achieve in this project. To start the process, we needed to identify a case study option for the feasibility study. So we defined a set of criteria and sub-criteria and to use in a multi-criteria decision analysis. So we considered things like the feasibility study, financial feasibility, looking at installation costs, looking at what energy sources were existing in terms of solar space availability, existing capacity of generators, what are the water sources available, how is the location in terms of vulnerability during hostilities, what community services were available, and how was the management of the community that was existing and their relationship with the authorities. So from the 6 options that we had, we were able to select the best option to proceed. So this is our community that was selected. It consists of residential towers with local businesses at the bottom of each tower. We have 2 water wells, 3 UN schools plus 1 governmental school, and one of the UN schools is also a shelter during hostilities. We have a health clinic run by the Ministry of Health, a kindergarten, and a mosque run by the Ministry of Religion. We've also identified additional residential towers in the case that we want to scale up the microgrid in the future. So to start the feasibility study, we first wanted to go to the community and gather more information from the community itself. So this included assessing the solar space available, considering that solar panels are basically the most feasible decentralized energy source in Gaza. The feasibility study itself consists of 4 sections. There's the stakeholder analysis, the technical analysis, the financial analysis, and looking at ownership and management options. I don't have time to go into the details of each, but we'll just do a high-level overview. So for the stakeholder analysis, we completed a questionnaire with representatives of each stakeholder group to determine what is their current situation, their baseline, and how will the project potentially impact each group of stakeholders. From these questionnaires, and also partly from our existing knowledge and awareness of our local staff here, we were able to develop and map out the interest versus influence of each stakeholder group. This provided insight to how we might want to engage with the different stakeholders as we continue in the process. So you can see in each quadrant, we had the different strategies of monitoring, keep satisfied, keep informed, engage closely, and influence actively. In the technical analysis, we have considered various demand scenarios, for example, covering the full demands of the community, covering the essential demands, or just the critical demands. We estimated or measured the demands of each stakeholder group to develop a 24-hour demand profile from which we've designed the various options for the electricity supply. So you can see here the options of the different size of solar array we could install depending on which demands we choose to cover. There are 2 modes of operation that we're considering. Normal is when the grid is on, and emergency, which is when the grid is off for prolonged periods. So for example, here we'll focus on the scenario 1, which is full demands in normal operations, which is when the grid is on. So in this case, we have 51% of the supply coming from the solar PV and 49% coming from the utility. During emergency operations, i.e. if the grid is off, we're considering 2 options. Firstly, with no batteries, and secondly, with batteries. So it's worth noting that batteries, firstly, are quite expensive, and secondly, are often considered a dual-use item in Gaza, so it might be quite difficult to bring them in. So when there are no batteries, the generators must run even during the solar hours to be able to energize the lines. If the generators are running, then they have to run at a minimum of 30% of their capacity in order not to cause damage to the generator itself. In this case, any surplus solar electricity will be lost since there is no energy storage mechanism. So you can see this is not the most efficient setup. If there are batteries in the system, then they can be used to energize the power lines during the solar hours, which allows the generators to be completely turned off in those hours. In this case, the surplus solar electricity is not enough to charge the batteries, so either the solar system will have to be expanded, or the batteries can be charged by the generators during the generator running hours. In this case, we have 53% of the supply from the PV and 47% from the generator. In the financial analysis, we considered the capital costs of the system. This is what will be funded by the ICRC. And this includes the consultant fees for the detailed design, the materials purchase, and the installation contract. And obviously, it'll vary very much depending on which size of system we choose to implement. And this is still under our consideration. We also determined operating costs, considering a 30-year lifespan analysis, and this takes into account the replacement costs of components at the end of their lifespan. So for example, the smart meters will need to be replaced in 15 years, so the cost of their replacement should be accounted for in these annualized costs. The operation and maintenance costs and asset leases were also included. These asset leases consider the value of certain existing assets owned by the community, including existing generators and PV, but also looking at the existing roof space that could be used for the solar panels. So this provides an incentive for the community to contribute their assets into the system. Based on these operating costs, the optimized tariff rates were determined for each electricity source, and the design options with the lowest tariffs were the most optimized. Of course, in this case, the utility tariff is set by the utility company. We also considered various different ownership and management options and combinations. So for example, this is a community-owned, utility-managed setup, which is not what we're deciding on, but it's one of the options that we're looking into. So in this case, the owners would have a net metering, the community would have a net metering agreement with the electricity utility company, and they would also have a contract for the operation and maintenance. The operation and maintenance responsibilities would be delegated to the local utility branch, and they would carry out these services, integrating their SCADA system with the smart meter components, of smart device components in the microgrid. So this means there'll be a back and flow of information. There will be one single financial transaction which considers the electricity tariffs for each source, the operation and maintenance fees from the contract, and minus the lease payments for the community. So while there's only actually one transaction, it effectively will provide monthly savings to the community because of the lease payments and because of the lower tariffs. And this savings will then eventually be used by the community for replacement costs or future expansion. Similarly, we mapped out the relationships and exchanges of some of the other ownership and management scenarios to develop our understanding of the various options. Based on these analyses, we're currently wrapping up the feasibility study and will soon proceed to the next steps. Firstly, we'll be presenting some of these options to the various stakeholders involved, and we'll need their buy-in in order for the project to remain viable. Next, we'll be doing a detailed design. We'll have a consultant to complete this, and then moving on to the procurement and installation, and finally the monitoring and evaluation, where we see the project impacts and learn from the process. So this brings an end to my presentation today. Thank you very much, and looking forward to any questions.